Hi everyone, this is going to be a quick overview of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and a basic outline of what you need to know. So we are just going to start by looking at the hypothalamus. First of all, you should notice that the hypothalamus is located within the central nervous system itself, and it is this small section that lies directly above the pituitary gland. Often you'll get exam questions that asks you to locate or identify the location of endocrine organs, and that's one that you can be tested on. We'll discuss this later on in the course, but you do need to know that the hypothalamus operates both nervously and with the endocrine system. They work in tandem and they help the body to work effectively and normally. Looking at this diagram here, we've got an enlarged cartoon diagram of the hypothalamus. This part gives you a clue that we are looking at the anterior side, and this smoother part is the posterior side. As we move down to the base of the hypothalamus, this area here is the stalk called the infundibulum. Now, the infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the two lobes of the pituitary gland. More on the pituitary gland in a second. The hypothalamus, in relation to the endocrine system, does a number of really important functions. The hypothalamus itself secretes releasing factors, sometimes abbreviated to RF, and inhibiting factors, abbreviated to IF. Now, as their names suggest, they help to regulate the concentration of hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So it's important that we associate releasing and inhibiting factors with the anterior pituitary gland. The stimulating factors will encourage the anterior pituitary gland to release more of a specific hormone. For example, it could be follicle stimulating hormone releasing factor that stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release more follicle stimulating hormone. If there's too much of that in the body, so for example, if you've completed the first half of the ovarian cycle, you would want to lower the levels of follicle stimulating hormone. Therefore, the hypothalamus would secrete inhibiting factors, which will slow down the release by the APG. Now, the hypothalamus also has an important neuronal function, which I talked about briefly, and it actually makes hormones. Okay, we're going to talk about this in more detail when we talk about the posterior pituitary gland, but the hypothalamus makes two hormones which are secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so let's look at more detail first at the anatomy of the pituitary gland itself. So first of all, pituitary gland is a pea-sized organ, so it's really quite small, sometimes referred to as the hypophysis. You don't need to call it that. The textbook references it, but we're good enough just referring to it as pituitary. The pituitary gland is joined to the hypothalamus by that stalk-like structure called the infundibulum. You do need to know the name for it, and spelling is important. So if you're someone who struggles with spelling for any reasons like dyslexia, it's fine to spell it phonetically and you'll still get credit. The pituitary gland itself has two distinct lobes. It's not one organ. Okay, you have the anterior, which is the anatomical word for front. The anterior pituitary gland has lots of blood vessels in it, and this is a true endocrine organ, and I'll talk more about that in a second. The posterior pituitary gland is not a true endocrine organ. It doesn't have as many blood vessels in it, and it receives nerves from the hypothalamus. All right, so more on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So I'm just going to zoom out so you can see all of this. Okay, so the hypothalamus contains lots of neurons. So these little circles and star-shaped things, these are meant to represent nerve cell bodies. And the shorter ones you can see connect to the anterior pituitary glands. So they are connecting to blood vessels in the infundibulum that go to the anterior side of the pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary gland, also sometimes known as the adenohypophysis, again, anterior pituitary gland is fine. Once you said that once or written that once, you can refer to it as the APG. This will release hormones that regulate other endocrine organs and cells in the body. Okay, the anterior pituitary gland secretes its own hormones, and you need to know them. And the regulation of how much hormone it secretes is controlled by releasing and inhibiting factors from the hypothalamus. So if these hypothalamic releasing or inhibiting factors are released, they will send a message via nerves to the portal blood vessels here, and that will connect with the anterior pituitary gland, and the APG will it will respond by sending signals and secreting hormones into the blood capillaries. So hormones, as we know, travel in the blood capillaries and they will move to their target organs or cells. Now, just to be clear, there are hormones that you do need to know. This table can be found in your textbook, and these are the hormones that you need to know are regulated by the pituitary gland. All right, so there's 6 hormones that are made in the APG. So gonadotrophic hormones, that's FSH and LH. Hopefully you should have an understanding of how they work from year 11. There's growth hormone. This affects all cells and promotes growth and protein synthesis. Thyroid stimulating hormone. So as the name suggests, this stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete its own hormone, which we know as thyroxine, and that has an effect on cell metabolism. We'll discuss more of that in the next lesson. Another hormone is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Again, you do need to be able to spell that. So a good way of helping yourself spell that is by sounding out the word and saying it out loud. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, as the start of the name suggests, targets the adrenal gland, specifically the cortex. So adrenocortico, or the AC, helps you to remember that we're targeting the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. There's also another area of the adrenal gland which we'll talk about later, but this is one that you need to know that is associated with ACTH. There are several hormones that come from the adrenal cortex. One that we need to know about is a low-level stress hormone called cortisol. Finally, the APG also secretes prolactin. This directly affects mammary glands and is important in milk production in mammals. Okay, so now we are going to talk finally about the posterior pituitary gland. This is also known as neurohypophysis. Again, you just need to know it as the posterior pituitary gland, or PPG. What is really important about this lobe of the pituitary is that it does not manufacture its own hormones. Therefore, it is not regarded as a true endocrine gland. Hormones that are secreted from the PPG are made in the hypothalamus. So there are nerve cell bodies in the hypothalamus which make two specific hormones, and these hormones are then sent down long axon fibers. You can see that in this cartoon here, and they are stored in the axon endings in the pituitary gland, in the posterior pituitary gland. When there is a signal to release these hormones, they are triggered by a nerve impulse, also known as an action potential, and these will be released into the bloodstream. Now, thankfully, there's only two hormones that you need to know about, and you will have met them before. So antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, targets the kidneys and is involved in the reabsorption of water and maintaining osmoregulation. Oxytocin is involved with contraction of the uterus during childbirth and labor, and also the ejection from milk from mammary glands. Okay, so that's a very quick overview of the hypothalamus, the APG and the PPG. I hope that was helpful for you. There is a copy of this mind map available to you in your OneNote if you want to look at it again.